Hello, my name is Emmanuel Symlar, and this is going to be my week 1 video summary. First off, let's start out by explaining what a virtual machine is. A virtual machine is essentially a computer within a computer. To run virtual machines, you need to download softwares like VMware Fusion or VMware Workstation. Now then, what I mean by running a computer within a computer would essentially mean that virtual machines run OSs separate or different from your main OS. For example, I'm running a Mac operating system, and I have virtual machines made for the Windows 10 operating system and Ubuntu operating system, Windows Server 2019, 2016, and a Cent operating system 7. Just to show what it looks like, let's open up Windows 10. While this is loading, let's quickly go over what kernels are. Now, when we're talking about kernels, we're talking about a central component of an operating system that acts as an interface between user applications and hardware. Now, the sole aim of the kernel is to manage the communication between software and the hardware. The main tasks of the kernel are process management, device management, memory management, interrupt handling, file system, and etc. Now, we have 3 types of kernel. The first one is named monolithic kernel. Now, monolithic kernels are fast and they're simple. However, their main downside is that they're simple to the point if a service fails on a monolithic kernel, the entire system is going to fail. Next, we have the microkernel, which is, say, microkernels are different from the monolithic kernels in the sense that they're a bit more complex and slower. They're a little bit more they're more secure. Not a little bit. They are more secure in a sense that if one of the files, the system services or files, something like that fails, it's not gonna the entire system isn't gonna fail, just that one component failed. That's it. It's slower, more complex, but you don't have to worry about everything failing. Monolithic kernel is faster, simpler, and you have to constantly worry about something like that happening. Because if something fails on the monolithic kernel, everything is going to fail. However, microkernel, if something fails on a microkernel, just that's going to fail. Everything isn't going to be affected by it. Next, we have the third kernel, which is going to be called the hybrid kernel. It's called a hybrid because of the fact that it takes the speed and simplicity from the monolithic kernel while using the modularity and the security from the microkernel, which in turn is why they call it the hybrid kernel. Now, the hybrid kernel is not as complex as the microkernel, but it's still secure. It's also faster than the microkernel. However, the hybrid kernel is more complex than the monolithic kernel and slower. But it's still more secure, and you won't really worry about having a system failure if just one of the system services fails. Now, back to this Windows 10 virtual machine. I'm going to open up Firefox here. It tells me I need to update Firefox. Anyways, so let's go here. We have system files right there, documents. It should open that up, which brings us to here. 3D objects, pictures, local disk C, program files, so on and so forth. This PC. Not now. Over here, the internet is working. The New York Times. And just to show you real quick, the processors and memory, I set up 4 process cores for this virtual machine and set up 4 gigabytes of RAM aside for it. I have 12 gigabytes of RAM remaining on my Mac, and let's go look at the hard disk. Now, this is the hard disk I've set up for, well, virtual disk. It's set aside 70 gigabytes of the amount of gigabytes I have installed onto the, not installed, but in this computer, 70 gigabytes aside for this virtual machine. See tell time, do this, check the battery, network settings, so on and so forth. Let's shut this down. One thing you never want to do is exit out, because that's just going to pause the virtual machine. It's not going to shut down the machine. And there we go. Let's start running Windows Server 2016. While that's starting up, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft. Now, when talking about Microsoft, we're going to be talking about Windows. Starting from the beginning, we have Windows 1.0, which came out in November 1985, and it replaced the Microsoft Disk operating system. But in reality, it just ran on top of it. It didn't really replace it. Then we have the Windows 2.0, which came out in December 9th, 1987. It replaced the Windows 1.0. It wasn't warmly received because this was when they first started implementing the mouse into computing, and it was still relatively new. People said that it was too mouse focused, and it was just not what they wanted. Then we have Windows 3.0 and 3.1, which came out on May 22nd, 1990. And Windows 3.1 came out on March 1st, 1992. It replaced Windows 2.0, and it was a lot more popular than Windows 1.0. However, its overlapping windows brought a lawsuit from Apple, which claimed that the new style infringed copyrights from the graphical user interface they had. Let's see, the most notable thing would be the speed it has. It was faster than ever on the new Intel 386 chips at the time. Next, we have Windows 95, which is when they first implemented the start button. That came out on August 24th, 1995. It replaced Windows 3.1 and the Microsoft Disk operating system. This is what really paved the path for Microsoft, Windows-wise. Next, we're going to have Windows 98 and Windows Millennium, which we never talk about, and Windows 2000. Now, these were all released in a flurry between 1998 and 2000 and are lumped together because there wasn't really much to distinguish them from Windows 95. They were essentially placeholders in the Microsoft lineup. However, Windows 2000, despite not being terribly popular with home consumers, reflected an important behind-the-scenes change in technology that aligned it more with Microsoft Server solutions. Parts of Windows 2000 technology remain inactive years, nearly 20 years later, so it had a lasting impact. Next we have Windows XP, which came out on October 25th, 2001 and replaced Windows 2000. Despite its age, Windows XP nowadays is still considered the second most popular Microsoft OS. Its main innovative feature is that it refuses to die. People still use it nowadays. It's several years after this end of life sunset for Microsoft. Next, we have Windows Vista, which is the Titanic of all Windows products, in a sense. No, not really. I'd have to say Windows 8 would be the Titanic. Anyways, Windows Vista came out on January 30th, 2007, and tried to replace Windows XP, however, it failed spectacularly. Windows Vista is the anti XP. Its name nowadays is synonymous with failure and ineptitude. When released, Vista required much better hardware to run than XP, which most people didn't have, and relatively few devices like printers and monitors worked with it because of the woeful lack of hardware devices drivers. Sorry about that. Hardware drivers available at launch. It wasn't as terrible as Windows ME, but it tanked so hard that for most people it was dead on arrival. They stayed on XP instead. Now, next we have Windows 7, which came out on October 22nd, 2009. Windows 7, to this day, remains one of the most popular used Windows, honestly. And it was a major hit to the public and earned a commanding market share of nearly 60% when it came out. It improved every way on Vista and helped the public eventually forget the the OS version of the Titanic. It's stable, secure, graphically friendly, and easy to use. And in just 8 hours, pre-orders of Windows 7 surpassed the total sales of Vista after 17 weeks. So that was sold out, so to speak. Anyways, next we have Windows 8, which came out on October 26, 2012. And this is Windows 8 tried to replace Windows 7, but failed miserably. Most people decided to stick with Windows 7. The people that decided to use Windows 8, they didn't really enjoy their experience too much. Me personally, I stuck to use the search bar the entire time because they took out the freaking start button, which to me, a good analogy that would go with this is taking the menu button away from a video game player. Like, it's just, where's my menu? My settings and menu screen is missing. Anyways, Microsoft tried to gain a foothold into the mobile world, including phones and tablets, but it didn't want to give up the user's traditional desktops and laptops, so it tried to create a hybrid OS, one that would work equally. So on touch and non-touch devices, it didn't work out. For the starter, as I mentioned, people did not like the fact that the start button was missing and there was constant confusion about how the tiles worked. Then they decided to release an update for Windows 8, which was 8.1, and the damage had already been done. No fixing that. Next, we're going to talk about Windows 10. Windows 10 was released on July 28th, 2015. It replaced Windows 8, 8.17, and Windows XP. Now, two major things to note about this one. Windows 10 is the return of the start menu, and secondly, that this will be allegedly the last named version of Windows. Nowadays, all you're really getting is future updates instead of new versions. And that is a quick history on Windows, Microsoft. And our server is up now, so let's go over this a little. Configure local, it's going to show me my computer name, settings, unknown, workgroup, firewall on, so on and so forth. Hardware information, VMware Incorporated, VMware 7.1 or 7.1. Sorry about that. Then we have processors. Here it shows two different processor cores, and it shows 2 gigabytes of RAM installed. Total disk space allocated for this virtual machine is 5968 gigabytes, but in reality it's gonna be 60 gigabytes, as you can see here. Processors 2 gigabytes of RAM, 248, 2.04, yeah, 2 gigabytes of RAM. Anyways, hard disks, I have 60 gigabytes of memory set aside for this specific virtual machine, and there we go. Now, as for four main components of a computer system would be the input devices, the output devices, the processing devices, and the storage devices used to store data within the computer system. These are hardware components of a computer system. Software is a set of digital instructions for the computer stored in the memory. Input devices are used to enter data into the computer system. They include the keyboard and mouse. Once the data is entered, they convert it into an internal form that can be processed by the central processing unit. The output devices are used to present the processed information to the user. They include the monitor and speakers. The processing devices perform actual processing of the data. The main processing device is the processor. The storage devices include the RAM and hard disk. They store the information within the computer system. And I would believe that is all. Yeah, I believe I've covered everything. I believe. I'm not entirely sure. Let's see. Uh, yes, server roles on. Right, I still have it paused. There we go. Anyway, server roles in Windows Server 2016 involve working through planning network design will involve server roles form an integral part of this exercise. What are server roles in Server 2016? A role is ideally a predefined set of features and services that you would like to specify for a particular function on the server and in your environment. A network is a group of hardware components and software components grouped and used to connect the devices within or outside the organization and the internet. The Windows Server 2016 offers you a host of features and functionalities when you install it onto your computer. The software components in a Windows Server system are always separated. This will facilitate you in adding up only few portions of software. These portions are what we call roles. Now, each of these roles will have multiple role services. The server roles are specific programs for providing the function of the role. We have server roles. These server roles are meant to provide services to the clients and the network, to the clients on the network. Some of these services include Active Directory, File, Print, DNS, DHCP, and Web. The mail server role. The mail server role is meant for sending and receiving email messages over the internet. You need to have access to a mail server for sending mail to others to each other over the network. The primary functions that a mail server performs include store email data, process client requests, and receive incoming email from the internet. What are the server roles available on Windows Server 2016? While most server roles are available on Windows Server editions, they differ from the licensing perspective. Now, Windows Server roles available on Windows Server 2016 standard would be the Active Directory Certificate Services, Active Directory Domain Services, Active Directory Federation Services, AD Lightweight Directory Services, AD Rights Management Services, Device Health Attestation, DHCP server, DNS server, fax server, file and storage services, branch cache for network files, data deduplication, file server resource manager, host guardian server, Hyper-V, multi-point services. It does not have a network controller, network policy, and access services. If it was installed with the desktop integration, it will have it. Print and document services, remote access, remote desktop services, volume activation services, web services, Windows deployment services if it was installed with the desktop experience, Windows Server's essential experience, and lastly, Windows Server's update services. And those were, I believe, the majority of the server roles that it had. And with that, I should have covered everything. And this is the end of my week 1 video summary.